Sorry, what? Why you fucking... Because you were the Raj red. Raj is my best friend.
That's also a moron.
Raj, you're off the EFL Grandfinals.
Hey, I know it's a pen. Blue pen or red pen.
What is the color of the pen? I literally have no blue or black or anything. Hey Lucian, do we promise each other no more of yesterday? Yeah, okay. But you will have to lead the motion to the open finals when last step is there. No, we didn't have it here. But we'll reach them outside. While we do the deliberation, he will leave the motion. Yeah. Hi guys. You don't want to start right now. Yeah, we'll that. I can do that. मेरे को जाके बात ये तो उतार दिया आपने जारी है यार Oh dude, Amit, what kind of pen you want?
What's next one?
This Josh has brought everything. One of the two of them should work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the EFL Grandfinals. We have a huge round of applause for all the teams that have made it to the Grandfinals. Congratulations. Okay, in opening round, we have UI1. In opening opposition, we have UNHAS. In closing government, we have KEIO1. And in closing opposition, ATMA1. Okay, Adma. Sorry guys. Okay, on panel. So my name is Unnati. I will be your chair for the Grandfinals. On panel we have Amrit, Ashish, Virat, Josh, Daniel, Lucian, and Raj, and Patrick. Okay. Okay, on the motion that this House supports the politics of class warfare, I invite the Prime Minister to open the case inside opening government. Come on.
Test, am I audible? Yeah, okay. Members of the House, much of the politics that we currently engage in and the status quo is a form of politics that is underlined by a dangerous form of good faith. That is to say, the politics as a way of thinking that does not recognize the inherent inertia that has been embedded in individuals' way of thinking due to their social class, for example, due to the fact that they're not willing to sacrifice their own conveniences right now to recognize the structural destruction that's currently happening around them and the shortchanging of certain particular members of society that are currently disenfranchised, right? We say that when in truth the system is working against these particular individuals, it is time for us to recognize that the most important way or the most rewarding way for us to be able to conduct these kinds of class politics is to engage in class warfare, to say that these are the enemy and we are the alliance that you need to participate in order for us to create and manifest any real change in society, right? We say that the current politics of reconciliation is particularly problematic when the breadth of society that is most populous and have the most to risk from a loss of their interests are the poor and the marginalized, the people who are living paycheck to paycheck, no thank you, that have their particular concerns cheapened by people telling them that they are being too demanding in the status quo. They are actually damaging the progress of their particular movement or their particular politics by being too by calling out these particular establishment, right? We prefer instead to like a vehicle to their righteous anger, ladies and gentlemen. Let them use that as a political beatstick to beat the establishment into submission. That is what we stand for under our side of the house. What do you imagine the politics of class warfare to look like, right? We think that most likely it's going to involve things like targeting and villainizing another class, like the rich and the privileged will happily concede to that. For example, the political establishment that's not willing to give any concessions to people who are desperate for survival. For example, we think that we're going to like tell them that they're getting fat on their silver spoons, and that's not justified. You need to redistribute that to the rest of society. We think that also involves class solidarity between people of our particular backgrounds, for example, that we have been given the short end of the stick, and it's righteous for us to be able to express this anger the only way that we know how. We think that's going to be emotionally cathartic and emotionally resonant towards the entirety of society, right? But then compared to what you have under your side of the house are things like preaching marginal change. Like when you look at Kamala Harris and Biden's piecemeal progressive policies, for example, that does not actually create any structural change, but only gives like a small tax cut to the middle class, for example. We think that that is the kind of policies that's going to be sustained on their side of the house. We think that they're also going to vilify radical change as well, that they're going to tell them that these are exactly what's wrong with our particular movement right now, and you are the particular reasons that people like you are suffering at this particular moment. We think that that is unjustifiable, right? Two substantives in my speech. Firstly, why the politics of class warfare is more likely to create structural change, and secondly, why we need to become the vehicle of righteous anger that these people rightly feel, right? So firstly, why the politics of class warfare is more likely to create structural change. You need to recognize that the people on the short end of the stick have to count their strengths and they have to count their blessings. That's to say, pardon me, the only strengths that we have as a particular member of society are the fact that we are populous in numbers, but also that we are morally unconflicted. Unlike, for example, rich liberals who have to lose if they want to support like redistributive policies, for example, we think that we are morally unconflicted in the sense that we want this redistribution and we know that we're in the right at the end of the day, right? We think that's how you that's how you give rise to incredibly powerful movements like Black Lives Matter, for example, like Pride, after Stonewall, that can pierce taboos and break glass ceilings because there are so many of us, for example, who are fully committed to our cause. We know that we're on the right side, and we know that we are the ones who are supposed to be catered to, right? I think that class warfare solidifies that because you're more likely to galvanize numbers because you speak your particular way of preaching speaks to the particular anger that they feel. For example, when they look back on the experiences that they experience as a minority, they are more likely to resonate with the messages that you are saying. For example, you affirm that their suffering is something that's legitimate rather than something that needs to be put on the back burner as you will have on their side of the house, right? And the comparative reconciliation damages that because you're telling these people that you need to manage your anger better, ladies and gentlemen. You need to make sure that that's dull in order for people to be able to relate to it. We don't think that that is something that's strategic. You have to concede to the oppressors that are oppressing you. They're actually good people, ladies and gentlemen, who want the best for you, but it's you that's not responding to their goodwill at the end of the day. We think that that is unpersuasive for people to want to join the movement at the end of the day, right? But assuming that we fail in our movement scenario, for example, say we overshoot in our demands, we say that that is something that's perfectly fine because we're more likely to get good policies as a compromise when we overshoot the demand and we don't like manage that anger at the end of the day, right? Because, for example, if you have the Green New Deal as something that's very ambitious in the status quo, we think Democrat establishment is already adopting pieces of it. So in the case that Green New Deal does not does not come into being, we think that there are still more marginal changes that we're able to derive from that, right? The comparative on the other side of the house is defeatism, that you don't introduce ideas because to begin with, they are too radical, for example, and we think that that's something that's bad. But secondly, we think that we also are better and able to galvanize participation in terms of movement turnout, for example, in terms of the donations that flow into our movement. We think that that is something that is particularly good for us to maintain. Second substantive, regarding why this is a vehicle of righteous anger that needs to be maintained, right? I think it's important to recognize that the marginalized have a lot of righteous anger that they currently feel. When Bezos, for example, is making his umpteenth billion while mothers struggle to feed their children, we think that that is something that we have to feel angry about. That truly people are evil out there and they're not willing to recognize our struggles in comparative to their conveniences, and we think it's something that you have to recognize, right? And you have the right to be angry about that when people refuse to sympathize with your condition out of convenience. No, thank you. I think that political platforms have to recognize that anger as legitimate, because first and foremost, that is something that's incredibly liberating and cathartic to the vast majority of society, to have someone who is established within the system recognize your struggles and be willing to fight for that, irrespective of how that fight turns out, just to know that there is that hope at the end of the tunnel, something that's already liberating for you at the end of the day, to have your concerns be legitimized in such a manner, right? And the comparative, at best, what opposition is promoting is apologism. That for example, you want changes to happen, but you also need to undercut it in the sense that the politicians will not be able to materialize it if you are that radical in the way that you try to pursue that, right? But at worst, what they have is vilification, that you're destructive to the progress, ladies and gentlemen, that you're trying to, and that your efforts is actually backfiring upon people who are of similar backgrounds, and that is something that's incredibly hurtful for these people, right? I think this is important because politics is not only about actual change, but the hope at the end of the tunnel to feel like change might happen in the future, ladies and gentlemen. We think that you need to have meaning to your fight when you continuously go out to marches, sacrificing like your daily pay, for example, in order for you to have that ownership within the movement. That's something that is inherently beneficial for you. And we say that we dropped that. This is particularly important in the case when we're talking about the disenfranchised, right? To no longer to have been disenfranchised so long from the system, to no longer have to ignore the call of a march that's erupting underneath your feet, ladies and gentlemen. We think that something is particularly important for these particular people. So I think that's what we grant them when we line flat to their righteous anger, and that's why we're very proud to open the debate.
Thank the Prime Minister for his speech and invite the Leader of the Opposition to introduce the case to the side opening of
Am I audible? What happened in status quo, the moment when we pursue democratics, that is the moment on how we should adapt with any kind of change, adapt with any kind of diverse opinion, different decision, because that is the way on how we could achieve a better democracy. So our stance is really clear that we would like to stay and be first in politics reconciliation and create a better discussion in evaluation in the process of making policy and so on and so forth. But before that, to respond to the opening government side, right? They're trying to explain 2 points. First is about the effectivity, and secondly about how in our side we create a marginal change and so on and so forth. So first is point about effectivity. We explain that the parameter of effectivity shouldn't be counted by how many times that you spend to create policy or even create decision, ladies and gentlemen. In our world, what we need on how it's not harm to the other people or even harm to other parties, because in their side, it more likely harm to the minority, even more, ladies and gentlemen. And most importantly, on how it can initiate the others, especially for that community or even several movements that not fit into those kinds of political class welfare, ladies and gentlemen. That is why in their side it's less likely to happen to create those kinds of major chance that they're trying to explain, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because it's shortcut just to keep their own interest, but more than that, it is harmful in their side because it's because it's especially harm to the minority, because these kinds of class welfare only focus to certain people that having more power, rich people, white people. That's why we say that these kinds of class welfare should would not support any layer of society, ladies and gentlemen. They even say in their side of the house, their best scenario, these kinds of minority can get the benefit. We say that it's less likely to happen, ladies and gentlemen, because first thing we have to understand this kinds of minority movement is hard to fit in on these kinds of politics class welfare, ladies and gentlemen. And I will explain to you more in my argument than why these kinds of class welfare would only exist into the certain people that having more power, ladies and gentlemen. That is why the idea of effectivity is even worse in their side, because comparative in our side, we want to create a discussion and the process evaluation of politics would even more better, because the society exists by by any kinds of layer of society, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, they're trying to explain about how in our side it's only create a marginal change. Ladies and gentlemen, in their side, it's even worse, because in their side will not create any change, ladies and gentlemen. Then if they want to create a major change, it's even less likely to happen. We have to characterize what is the politics characterization, ladies and gentlemen. In politics, we couldn't that radical or create extreme way, because the characterization of political process is by creating an extreme decision or even create massive chaos would even hurt in their side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. For example, you cannot directly support the radical movement in the conservative area, because that is how it backlash to the idea, the value, or the identity of the certain movement has, ladies and gentlemen. So it's hurtful in the side of the house. That is why we need to create a step by step, establish our niche and our niche in the manner way, ladies and gentlemen. So the idea about participation would even hurt in their side of the house. That is why we say that in comparative, it's better in our side, because we fit into the any layer of society that even cannot get this kinds of voice in the politic class welfare, ladies and gentlemen. So what opening opposition try to explain here, first is that how the political reconciliation could extend and pursue the concession, but secondly on how in our side would create a diversity in the political progress, and how the political diversity is better in our side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. So first, on how the discussion would be even worse in the side of the house. Ladies and gentlemen, in the side of the house, it's more likely one side interest, ladies and gentlemen. Also, it is harmful because always detrimental to the other politics without any process of evaluation. Because we have to understand the characterization of these kinds of class welfare only focus to the certain interest of people, but secondly, always going to become the opposition at the end of the day. Why we do not like that? Because at the end of the day, the process of discussion and the quality of discussion only focus to their own interest, and also avoid and also dismissive towards to any kinds of interest, especially from the interest of minority, ladies and gentlemen. It is harmful for democracy because they always prioritize the powerful people, for example, white people, rich people, and they have no way to protect minority at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. But even if in their politics it would be effective because it's based on one voter base, we say that it's not about the actors' debate, ladies and gentlemen. This debate is about how the process of evaluation would be better. So that is why that whether or not the people would get harmed and detrimental by their system, ladies and gentlemen. So the benefit in the side of the house only exists for majority, and so on and so forth. So what we want in our work life? No, thank you, because the process of evaluation and discussion would even better in our side, ladies and gentlemen, and it's more safer in our side because the people or the politics might not diminish other people, might not diminish towards to other politics, ladies and gentlemen. So example in the past that we are more likely to be radical left, but right now we are more centrist, for example. That is why this is show you the dynamics of political system would better in our side and better to create policies that which are better to the people at the end of the day. Second point is about how by create this kind of by staying in this kind of political reconciliation would create a diversity in political progress. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to understand that these kinds of class welfare they don't want to be compromised at the end of the day. They will always fit into their own interest and stay to their own interest, ladies and gentlemen. So I will explain to you why in the process of politics it's important to be compromised, because it's necessary, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because we are always need to adapt with our policies, adapt with what happened in status quo towards to our citizens, for example. This is important because in the government side, government unable to adapt with the certain policies because they keep consistent in their own interest, ladies and gentlemen. So what is the outcome in opening opposition? In their side, more likely to central of power, there will be central of power, ladies and gentlemen, and it would become more bigger. Comparative in our side, we appreciate any form of diversity, diverse values, and diverse opinions towards other people. That's why we believe that food has to bring this topic home. Thank you.
I'd like to hand the leader of opposition for her speech and invite the deputy prime minister to extend the keys to the side of the government.
Test. Before I start my speech, I'm not sure if Razak is here, but I dedicate the speech to Bobby Daddy. All right. I'll start my speech. Panels. Opening opposition chose to choose the urgency of better ideas and more diversity of ideas. Mainly, their problem with our case of political class warfare is to say that we will make the ideologies of the minorities or the interests of the minorities die out because we will galvanize the majority. I find this idea really, really weird, given that class warfare would rely on the most vulnerable people and the largest the largest class in the political landscape, which is most likely the poor to middle class, right? And it's highly unlikely to the middle upper class to the upper class. So we think that the case of opening opposition is dead on arrival just because it's very much unrealistic in how it will play out in real life. I'll talk about two things in my speech. Firstly, I'll talk about who's more likely in this case to create better policy making. Secondly, I'll talk about who's more likely to create better participation by the people in politics, right? So, firstly, who's more likely to create better policy making? Adam told you a really important idea, that we have currently a problem in which the politics of reconciliation creates piecemeal policies, right? I'll extend this a bit. The reason why this is the case is because under the politics of reconciliation, politicians do two things. One, they consider the other side too much, that makes them have very easy concessions to the other side, right? That's why most likely you get half-baked policies like Obamacare, but also that politicians are on their side too excited to get their policies done as a show of political success. We think that this is really, really bad because then you concede to things that are not beneficial to your target, like getting people actually insured in more healthcare, like appeasing to private corporations. That is not a good strategy, right? To actually get the target of giving people the welfare that they need. The comparative on our side is you set the bar at a much higher pace, right? That you need to make structural changes in the things that you want to change to actually achieve your goal. So you don't make easy concessions, but the concessions that you do make in the future actually matter because it gives you the structural change you need. This is like currently the American Congress voting for criminal reform and having concessions at tax cuts, which is okay because at least the criminal reform part, you actually help the vulnerable Black people that are in prison because of unjustified drug charges. Before I move on, closing.
You realize that people, if you are seen as asking too much, why won't your issues as radicalists might be going to be related even more?
Okay, so this is going to be generally the line of opening opposition and basically closing opposition, right? There's going to be a deadlock. You're going to fire up the other base. Firstly, to respond to that POI, you're unlikely to fire up the other base since the other base is the middle upper class that would not increase in any type of power, right? Their only power is giving money. So in a comparative on our side is when we have much more people demanding much more things, it's highly likely that politicians are going to be much more responsive to the more malleable voter base that can actually increase in power rather than just giving money on their side. But secondly, I think that on this point about deadlock, what the opening opposition also talked about, right? It's unlikely to happen because on our side, it's likely that conservatives or people who are much less genuine would be much less popular because you make politicians able in doing campaigns that attacks the identity of these bad politicians, right? Exposing their voting records, actually like taking a look at where their money comes from, like from lobbying groups that are not interested in benefiting the classes that they claim to defend in the very first place, right? So this is why you don't get deadlock because the other side is just much less powerful. But secondly, the comparative in the worst case on our side is that we actually stop bills that are destructive to people's lives, right? If you only make concessions for concession's sake, you don't actually stop these bills. You just adopt parts of these bills, or you let parts of these bills that are actually destructive to your class because you want the interest of passing your own policies, and that is really bad, right? But the last thing that opening opposition talked about in this issue is to say that, oh, on our side there will be no exploration of ideas, so when ideas don't work, things will basically go to shit because we're just that inflexible, right? No, that's not true. Because even when we are in class warfare, we have a goal in benefiting a certain class. So let's say that we're in a class warfare for benefiting the blue collar class. It's likely that we will constantly evaluate the policies and if it actually is beneficial for the blue collar workers, right? So it's unlikely that we'll repeat the mistakes all the time just because we are not able, just because we're doing class warfare. It's likely that there will be more checks and balances coming from the more energized voter base, which is the issue that they didn't touch, right? Who's more likely to create better participation? And this is very important because without participation, right, you're not able to create check and balances in the government or create any meaningful change. They haven't told you why on their side specifically, using the politics of reconciliation is likely to protect the most vulnerable people. We tell you that through participation that it would. We told you that on our side, people are much more likely to be fully committed to our cause because their anger is not delegitimized. But this is not only a psychological benefit, right? It's also a check and balance mechanism towards the politicians that are representing these people. Because when you are angry and your anger is legitimized, it's much more likely for you to voice out concerns as to the impact of the policies that the politicians that represents you as to the harms of that comes from the impact of the policies that your politicians have voted for, right? That means that if for the party itself or for the politicians that claim to protect the vulnerable people, it's much more likely that they're going to be responsive and going to change the policies or modify the policies in the future. The comparative on their side is these people will always be seen as people who are destructive to the political standing of these politicians. So they will look for other voter bases, look for the center, right? That's why they will abandon the policies that actually benefit these people and try to move closer to the middle or higher class, right? That's when it's really, really bad for those who are poor, for those who actually need help. And that's why we're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech and invite the Deputy Opposition. Please come to the forward opposition.
Yes. I think OG failed in this debate because their only argumentation in which why radical policies are going to be accepted is because deadlocks won't happen because other majorities or other people doesn't have power to reject that. I think this is dismissed in the majority of most political conditions in most countries are facing, in which there is always opposition that are able to have different policies and always try to reject your policies. I think almost every country have this, ladies and gentlemen. So I think this also make all of their benefits cannot fly because of this inability to explain why the radical policies are going to be accepted. But before going to my argument, several direct rebuttals. One, they say that marginal policies happen in our side. I think this dismiss entirely our context. I think in the current status quo, the politics of reconciliation doesn't mean that you always accept destructive policies. In the current status quo, you can always say that other policies are not good, but saying that it's maybe their goodwill. So I think in the current status quo, the discussion upon the effectivity doesn't mean it doesn't happen in our side. So I think our opposition that happens and exists in our side will not mean that instantaneously going to be stupid and accept destructive policies towards their own political constituents, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, I think in a comparative, having marginal policies is much better rather than having no policies at all in their side. Because by having marginal policies, A means that at least you can appease several people in current status quo that is your constituents, but B, you can have temporary change. Because in the current status quo, most likely our ability to grow is having first temporary change and have collective and maybe several years that can make your policies to be better in the future. But the second argument is they can galvanize more members and can collectivize more members. I think first response is it is entirely very inexclusive. Because in our side, we can still galvanize members by maybe saying good socialization, better ability to appeal towards individuals by saying that in the current status quo, the discussion about policies and the discussion of politics is actually not toxic anymore because somehow we can compromise to certain situations, thus making discussion to be much better, in which my elbow explained in her argument. But secondly, they're talking about why this will create a better liberating because you empower more individuals and empower individuals to engage more in participation. The last argument of EPM. I think, ladies and gentlemen, that participation means that you have the capability to engage to how people react in the current status quo, in which I think is my first argument. Because I think the opening government are able to explain the characterization of how in different worlds this will affect people, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, notice the politics of warfare, why it's going to harm badly on how people perceive politics. Because in the current status quo, they will see that everything that happens is politics is always oppositional and is always demonizing the other members, that their policies is always the best. This is harmful because notice that in almost all contexts, policies change in different situations, and sometimes politicians need to change their stances. I think this is going to harm the individual's ability to engage in politics because they see that maybe the ideology of the politicians that they support in the past are unable to cater towards the differences and the changes of policies that are happening in the current status quo. In comparison, ladies and gentlemen, in our side, they can adapt more because their ability to engage in much more coherent discussions are better going to be able to make them to be having good policies discussions. But secondly, notice that the direct characterizations of class warfare, ladies and gentlemen, is how you always think that you are the best. How does this implement in the real world situation, gentlemen? It is you always make an A minus towards your policies with other members, gentlemen. So how does this look? It looks like you are always making lingos that are bad towards your opposition, and you always make the social narrative that your opponents is always very, very bad towards the constituents. This is very bad because it's made discussion to be very toxic to the extent where you are never evaluating policies, but always saying that the other side is always bad, but not saying why is your policies actually effective in the long run. In comparison, in our side, the politics of goodwill makes you able to holistically evaluate the policies more because you are not always saying a minus, but always trying to recharacterize and always re-identify what is the lacks of your policies. So I think this harms this better this ability to affect people. They're actually able to tackle the argument of participation. But before second argument, closing.
Politics of class conflict does not mean that these people are just radical, never compromise angry people, because they have to reason to why their interests are justified. They have to pass a bill in a parliament. Why that calculation is true.
Yeah, they're only going to reason towards their own political supporters, but not going to reason to maybe the other policies that might be effective in that sense. So I think what does this mean? That in that opening government world, they're always trying to reject all of the other policies that might be beneficial for them, such as in how Obamacare are actually beneficial towards all people and how it is successful in trying to give benefits towards people. But they cannot just say that there is the possibility for you just to instantaneously engage to all people. Because just like what the info slides say, class warfare means that you have no capability to bridge discussion and bridge compromise. So I think it's a fiat of definition there. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, why this creates the incapability to actually create policies and the capability to actually give people options. I think, ladies and gentlemen, the most important thing to take from opening opposition is A, you have better capability to create policies. Why? Because notice that in the current status quo, to create policies, you are not able to only just cater to certain people. You always have to cater to a large voter base and largely pandering to so much people. I think this is much better in our side. How? Because in the process, you are going to say and acknowledge that maybe in some circumstances and in some situations, you are able to tackle these kinds of problems, such as how Obamacare succeed, because they can see that these kinds of policies is actually maybe the betterment also towards the Republican gentlemen. In their side, Obamacare are not going to happen and to not always going to benefit these kinds of people that are suffering in the current status quo. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, how it also is the capability of people to engage to more diverse options. Because notice that in the current status quo, the moment class warfare happens, it is only going to engage towards the people that are majority. Sure, they see maybe there are a very good large amount of people that are actually minority, but this hasn't happened in the majority, where they control discussions, they control narratives, and they control politicians that have money and capital that funds the campaigns, that funds all these policies that happen. So I think probably these kinds of things are not going to engage towards them because their ability to be able to fit in towards the definition of these kinds of politicians are not going to exist. Ladies and gentlemen, I think opening opposition wins on the probability to gain better policies, thus tackling opening government for all. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Now moving to the closing remarks of the debate, I'd like to invite the Member of Government to present his closing government. Go, go!